The morning air bit sharp against his skin, the kind of cold that slips through layers of clothing like it's got a personal mission. He sat on the edge of a cracked concrete bench near the old bus station, the one that hadn't seen a working schedule in over a year. Around him, the city stirred awake. Delivery trucks rumbled, shop owners rolled up their metal grates, and commuters hurried past with steaming cups in hand, eyes locked on their phones or the next train. Nobody looked at him. Not really. To most, he was just part of the scenery, like a broken street lamp or a faded poster peeling off a wall. He'd been awake since before sunrise. Sleep never came easy anymore. Not on cardboard, not with the wind howling between alley walls, not with the constant hum of sirens in the distance. But he didn't complain. Complaining hadn't gotten him anywhere in a long time. Instead, he kept his coat zipped tight, his hands tucked into his sleeves, and his eyes on the ground. The coat was old, frayed at the cuffs, but it had once meant something. On the left shoulder, barely visible under years of grime and patchwork stitching, was a small American flag, faded blue, threadbare red and white. He never took it off, even in summer. It was the last thing that still felt like his. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its tires crunching over broken glass and scattered trash. He didn't flinch. He'd seen them before. Sometimes they'd nod, sometimes they'd tell him to move along, sometimes they'd just drive past like he wasn't there. But today the car stopped. Two officers stepped out, boots clicking on the pavement. One was young, with a stiff posture and a radio clipped to his shoulder. The other was older, with tired eyes and a slight limp. "Sir," the younger one said, voice firm but not unkind. "You can't be here. This is private property." He looked up slowly. His face was lined with years, his beard streaked with gray, but his eyes were clear. Calm, steady, like someone who'd seen too much to be rattled by a routine warning. "I wasn't causing trouble," he said quietly. "Just resting." "We've had complaints," the older officer said, glancing toward the boarded-up station. "You've been here 3 nights in a row." He nodded. He knew. He'd counted them. 3 nights under the overhang, out of the rain, away from the worst of the wind. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. "Come on," the younger officer said, stepping closer. "We'll take you to the warming center downtown." He shook his head. "They turned me away last week, said I didn't have ID." "You got any ID on you now?" He patted his pockets slowly, pulling out a worn wallet. Inside was a crumpled Social Security card, a folded photo of a younger man in uniform standing beside a woman and a child, and an expired driver's license from another state, over a decade old. The photo barely resembled him now. The officers exchanged a look. The older one sighed. "Look, we don't want to do this, but if you don't move, we have to cite you for trespassing." He didn't argue. He stood slowly, joints stiff from the cold. He gathered his few belongings, a rolled-up blanket, a plastic bag with a toothbrush and a half-empty water bottle, a small notebook with pages filled in careful handwriting. As he stood, the flag patch on his coat caught the morning light for just a second. The younger officer hesitated. You ever serve?" He gave a small nod. "Long time ago." No follow-up question came. No salute. No handshake. No, "Thank you for your service." Just a nod, and then the cuffs, cold metal clicking around his wrists. Not tight, not rough, but final. He didn't resist. He'd been trained to follow orders once. Old habits die hard. At the precinct, the process was routine. Fingerprinted, photographed. Asked the same questions over and over. Name? Date of birth? Address? He gave his name clearly, but when asked for an address, he just said, "Don't got one right now." The desk sergeant typed it in as homeless, like it was a location on a map. No one asked about the military. No one checked his records. The system wasn't built for stories. It was built for files, codes, checkboxes. And in that system, he was just another case number, another body to process before lunch. His public defender, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his tie, Met him an hour later in a holding room. They had 10 minutes. The lawyer flipped through the thin file. Loitering and trespassing, he said. First offense. Probably just a fine or community service. But, you got any ID? Proof of veteran status? Could help with alternatives. He shook his head. Lost most of my papers when I lost my apartment. Tried to get replacements, but he trailed off. The VA office had sent him in circles for months. Without a fixed address, without a phone, without someone to advocate for him, the doors kept closing. The lawyer nodded, not unsympathetically, but with the weary resignation of someone who'd heard it all before. All right, we'll plead not guilty. Ask for leniency. Court dates in 3 days. 3 days later, he was led into the courtroom in the same clothes, unwashed, unshaven, still wearing that old coat. His hands were cuffed in front this time, not behind. Small mercy, maybe. He kept his gaze, down as he walked. Not out of shame, but because he'd learned long ago that looking people in the eye when you're at the bottom only invites more trouble. The room buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Clerks shuffling papers, lawyers whispering to clients. The low hum of anxiety and boredom mixed together. He was seated in the defendant's chair, the wood cold beneath him. He didn't fidget. He didn't speak. He just waited, like he'd waited for buses that never came, for calls that never rang, for help that never arrived. The bailiff called his name, full name, clear and official. It echoed off the high ceilings, bouncing off marble and wood and glass. And somewhere in that room, behind the bench, a woman in a black robe heard it, really heard it. But that moment, the shift, the gasp, the silence that followed, was still a few seconds away. For now, he was just a man in a courtroom, tired, forgotten, carrying a lifetime of service in his bones and a flag on his shoulder, wondering if today would be the day someone finally saw him. Not as a problem, not as a statistic, but as a person. Outside, the city kept moving, but inside that courtroom something was about to change. Not because of a law, not because of a policy, but because of a name that still meant something to someone. And sometimes that's all it takes. The courtroom smelled like old wood, coffee, and the faint tang of nervous sweat. It was one of those municipal courtrooms that saw more traffic violations than trials. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a water cooler in the corner that never seemed to work. The judge sat high above everyone else, behind a wide wooden bench that looked like it had been there since the city was built. She was in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly and glasses perched low on her nose. Her expression was calm, practiced, the kind that came from decades of listening to people explain why they ran red lights or forgot to pay parking tickets. She flipped through the morning's docket with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Most days blurred together. Small offenses, small consequences, small lives passing through like leaves in a gutter. She treated each case with fairness, but also with speed. There was a line out the door, after all. Then came the next name. The people versus full name, the bailiff announced, voice echoing slightly in the half-full room. She read the name off the paper without looking up at first. Standard procedure. But halfway through, her eyes flickered. She paused. Read it again. Slower this time. Something about those syllables, how they landed, how they fit together, pulled her back. Not just to a file or a case, but to a memory, a real one, sharp and sudden like a photograph flipping open in her mind. She lifted her head. There, standing in the defendant's box, was a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His coat was worn thin, his shoes cracked at the sole, his hands resting loosely in front of him, cuffed but not tense. He didn't look angry, didn't look defiant. Just tired, deeply, bone-achingly tired. But it was his eyes that caught her, steady, quiet. The kind of eyes that had seen things most people never would, and carried them without complaint. She leaned forward slightly, fingers resting on the edge of the bench. Mr. Last Name, she said, her voice softer than usual. Were you stationed at Fort Bragg in the early 1980s? A ripple went through the room. The public defender, who'd been scribbling notes, looked up. The prosecutor paused mid-sip of coffee. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a second. The man in the box blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected to be asked a question like that. Not here, not now. He nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, from 81 to 85, and were you part of the 82nd Airborne? Another nod. Yes, ma'am. She didn't move for a long moment. Then very quietly she said, Do you remember a lieutenant named Daniel Whitmore? This time his eyes widened just a fraction. He searched her face not with fear but with dawning recognition. You're his sister? She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her throat tightened. She cleared it gently, but the room had already gone still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. Yes, she said. He talked about you every year. Said you pulled him out of a training ditch during a live fire exercise when his leg got pinned under equipment. Said you stayed with him in the mud for 2 hours until medics came. Even though you weren't supposed to be there. You'd finished your rotation, but you stayed to help. The man looked down for a second as if the memory weighed heavy. He was bleeding bad, he said simply. Couldn't leave him. You saved his life, she said, voice thick now. He told me that for years. Said you never asked for anything in return. Just walked away like it was nothing. He shook his head. It wasn't nothing. But it was my job. She took a slow breath. Then without warning, she stood up. The entire courtroom tensed. Judges didn't just stand mid-case unless something serious was happening. But instead of calling for order or declaring a recess, she turned to face the room. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice clear and strong now, carrying to every corner. This man standing before you isn't just another defendant. He's a decorated veteran. He served 2 tours overseas. He received the Soldier's Medal for heroism. Not for fighting, but for saving a fellow soldier's life in peacetime. And that soldier was my brother. A stunned silence fell. You could hear someone's pen drop. Then from the back, a bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with a Marine Corps tattoo peeking from his sleeve, stood up. Not because he was told to, just because he felt he should. Then the court clerk rose. Then the prosecutor. Then the public defender. One by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, everyone in the room got to their feet. Even the 2 people waiting for their own traffic cases stood, not entirely sure why, but sensing this was something bigger than procedure. The man in the defendant's box looked around, bewildered. His eyes filled, not with tears, not exactly, but with something deeper. Something like disbelief mixed with relief. Like he'd been invisible for so long, and suddenly, in this cold, fluorescent room, someone had truly seen him. The judge stepped down from the bench. Not all the way, just enough to be on the same level. She walked slowly toward him, her robe whispering against the floor. Do you have a place to stay? She asked quietly. He shook his head. Not right now. Are you getting the help you need? Medical, housing, support? He gave a small, sad smile. Tried. Hard to get through the doors when you don't got an address, don't got a phone, don't got much of anything. She nodded. Then she turned to the prosecutor. Are you pressing charges? The prosecutor, still standing, hesitated only a second. Your Honor, no. Absolutely not. Then this case is dismissed, she said firmly. With prejudice. A murmur ran through the room, not of disappointment but of quiet approval. But she wasn't done. She turned back to the man. You're not alone, she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear clearly. Not anymore. He didn't say anything. Just nodded, his jaw tight. But his shoulders, hunched for so long under the weight of being forgotten, seemed to straighten just a little. Outside the courtroom, life went on as usual. Cars honked. People rushed to lunch. But inside, something rare had happened. Not justice exactly, though that was part of it, but something more human. Recognition. Respect. The kind that doesn't come from a policy or a program, but from one person remembering another's name and what it meant. And as the man stepped out of the cuffs, accepted a tissue from the court clerk, and was gently guided toward a side office where someone would finally listen to his whole story, the room stayed standing for a long time. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because sometimes the right thing to do isn't written in law. It's written in how we treat each other when no one's watching. Except this time, everyone was watching. And they'd never forget what they saw. News travels fast when it carries heart. By lunchtime, someone in the courthouse had recorded a short clip. Just 10 seconds of the judge standing, the room rising, the quiet moment that followed. They didn't post it with a headline or dramatic music, just a shaky phone video with the caption, "This happened in court today." Within an hour, it had been shared thousands of times. By evening, local news vans were parked outside the courthouse, reporters trying to piece together who the man was, where he'd gone, what had led him there. But no one had his full story yet, just fragments. Veteran, homeless, wrongfully charged, recognized by a judge who knew his name. The judge didn't give interviews. She asked the court staff to respect the man's privacy. But that only made people more curious and more moved. Strangers began calling the courthouse, the local VA office, even the police department, asking, "How can we help him?" Meanwhile, he wasn't at a shelter or back on the streets. He was sitting in a small, warm office down the hall from the courtroom, wrapped in a donated blanket, holding a paper cup of hot coffee that someone had quietly placed in his hands. A social worker from the county's Veterans Outreach team had been called in, someone who actually knew how to navigate the maze of benefits, housing programs, and medical records that had shut him out for years. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't being rushed. He wasn't being told not today or come back with more paperwork. He was being listened to. "I lost everything after my wife got sick," he said, voice low but steady. "Medical bills. The house. Then my own health started failing. Bad back, PTSD they never really treated. I tried staying with friends, but you can't lean on people forever." The social worker nodded, taking notes not like a bureaucrat, but like someone who'd heard this song before and knew every verse. "We're going to get your records pulled today," she said. "Your discharge papers, your service history, your VA file. Once we have that, we can fast-track housing, health care, even a stipend for essentials." He looked at her, not with hope exactly. Hope had been worn thin, but with something close to cautious trust. "You sure they'll listen this time?" "I'll make sure they do," she said. That night, he didn't sleep under a bridge or in a doorway. He stayed in a temporary room at a veterans transition center. Clean sheets, a locked door, a hot shower. He stood under the water for a long time, letting the steam loosen the knots in his shoulders, washing away more than just dirt. The next morning, his story broke wide open. A local news anchor, herself an Army veteran, shared the courtroom video on her personal page with a simple message. "This is why we say, never forget." But remembering isn't just about parades. It's about making sure our people don't fall through the cracks. Donations poured in. A retired firefighter started a GoFundMe, not for himself, just for the veteran from the courtroom. He wrote, "If you've ever worn a uniform, or loved someone who did, you know how thin the line is between stability and the street. Let's give him a real second chance." By noon, they'd raised $20,000. By midnight, over $150,000. People gave $5, $200 along with messages. "Thank you for your service. My dad was like you, wish someone had helped him. You deserve dignity." But the most unexpected visitor came the following afternoon. The judge arrived not in her robe, not with a camera crew, but in a simple coat and scarf, carrying a manila envelope. She found him in the common room of the center, sitting by a window with a book someone had given him. He stood when he saw her. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I wanted to," she replied. She sat beside him, not across from him, side by side like equals. Then she opened the envelope and pulled out a faded photograph. In it, a young lieutenant with a wide grin stood arm in arm with a younger version of the man beside her. Both in fatigues, mud on their boots, sun on their faces. "My brother kept this on his desk his whole life," she said softly. "He wrote you a letter once after he got out. Tried to send it, but your address had changed. He never knew if you got it." She handed him a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, sealed in plastic. He opened it slowly, hands trembling just slightly. The handwriting was neat, earnest. "You didn't just save my leg that day, you saved my future. I got to marry the love of my life, raise 2 kids, watch my daughter graduate college. None of that happens if you walk away. I'll never be able to repay you, but I promise I'll never forget you. Thank you, brother." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and held it against his chest. "I didn't know," he whispered. I thought no one remembered." "I remembered," she said. "And now, thanks to that moment in court, so does everyone else." They sat in silence for a while, watching rain patter against the window. No grand speeches, no cameras, just 2 people connected by a thread of history, loss, and gratitude. Later that week, the city's mayor called. A nonprofit offered him a fully furnished apartment in a building reserved for veterans, with on-site counseling and job placement help. A local tailor volunteered to make him a new suit. A barber gave him a shave and a haircut, refusing payment. But what mattered most wasn't the money or the apartment or even the public attention. It was the look in people's eyes when they spoke to him now, not with pity, not with suspicion, but with respect, with recognition. He started going to the VA not as a nameless file, but as someone they knew. Nurses greeted him by name. Doctors listened. Therapists didn't rush him through sessions, and slowly, the weight he'd carried for years, the invisible weight of being unseen, began to lift. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person saying, "I know who you are," to remind someone they still matter. And once that spark is lit, it doesn't just change one life, it lights a path for others too. 6 months had passed since that morning in the courtroom, and the world around him had changed in ways he never imagined possible. But the biggest change wasn't in his surroundings. It was in the way he carried himself. He now lived in a small sunlit apartment on the 3rd floor of a building reserved for veterans. It wasn't fancy, just 2 rooms, a kitchenette, and a window that looked out over a quiet street with trees that turned gold in the fall. But it was his. His name was on the lease. His coffee mug sat on the counter. His medals, polished and framed, hung on the wall beside a photo of him in uniform, young and sharp-eyed, standing tall like he believed the future would be kind. Every morning, he woke at dawn, not because he had to, but because old habits still held strong. He made coffee, fed the stray cat that had adopted his balcony, and sat for a few minutes in silence, watching the neighborhood come alive. No sirens, no shouting, just birds, distant traffic, the soft hum of ordinary life. He'd started volunteering 3 days a week at a local outreach center that helped homeless veterans navigate paperwork, find shelter, and connect with counselors. He didn't give speeches. He just listened, because he knew what it felt like to be talked over, to be handed forms with no explanation, to be told, "You don't qualify," without anyone asking why. At the center, he'd sit across from men and women with tired eyes and worn boots and say things like, "I've been where you are," or "Let me walk you through this," or simply, "You're not alone." Sometimes that was enough. One afternoon, a young veteran, barely 30, fresh out of the service, lost and overwhelmed, sat across from him, head in his hands. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered. "Start with your name," he said gently. "Just say it out loud, own it. Everything else comes after." The young man looked up, surprised, then nodded. That same week, he received an invitation he never expected, to speak at a national summit on veteran homelessness. Organizers had seen the courtroom video, read about his journey, and wanted him to share his story, not as a victim, but as proof that change is possible when people choose to see each other fully. He almost said no. Public speaking wasn't his thing. He'd never liked being the center of attention. But then he thought about all the faces he'd met at the outreach center, the ones who'd looked at him like he held a map out of the dark. And he said yes. The day of the event, he stood backstage in a borrowed suit, hands clasped to keep them from shaking. The room was packed, hundreds of people, policymakers, nonprofit leaders, fellow veterans, reporters. He took a deep breath, smoothed his lapel, and stepped onto the stage. There were no dramatic pauses, no rehearsed lines. Just honesty. "I didn't think I'd live to see a day like this," he began, voice calm but clear. "For years I felt like I disappeared. Like my service didn't count once I took off the uniform. Like I was just noise in the background." He spoke about the shame of asking for help, about the fear of being judged, about how easy it is to fall through the cracks when you're already carrying invisible wounds. But that day in court, he said, someone didn't just see a homeless man. She saw a person. She remembered my name. And that one act of recognition, it didn't just change my life. It reminded me that dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you're born with, and no one should ever lose it. The room was silent when he finished. Then came the applause, not polite clapping, but something deeper. People stood, not because they were supposed to, but because they felt it. Afterward, dozens came up to thank him. One woman, a city council member, pulled him aside. "Your story moved me," she said. "We're drafting a new policy, fast-tracking housing and benefits for homeless veterans using verified service records No waiting lists, no runaround. We're calling it, well, we'd be honored if we could name it after you. He hesitated. I don't need my name on anything, he said. Just make sure it helps people, she smiled. Then we'll call it the Recognition Act, because that's what started it all. Back home that evening, he sat on his balcony as the sun set. The judge had sent him a note that morning. You're doing what my brother always hoped you would, leading with quiet strength. He folded it and tucked it into the same drawer as the old letter. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous, but he was seen. And more importantly, he was helping others be seen too. A few days later, he returned to the outreach center. As he walked in, a man he'd helped get into housing the month before stood up and gave him a firm handshake. Got my first paycheck yesterday, the man said, grinning. Bought my daughter a bike. He just nodded, but inside something warm settled in his chest. This was the real victory. Not the headlines, not the donations, not even the apartment. It was this, one person helping another find their footing, because someone once did the same for them, and in a world that often moves too fast to notice, that kind of chain reaction, human to human, heart to heart, is the most powerful thing of all. A year had passed since that cold morning when he'd been led into the courtroom in handcuffs, head down, shoulders bent under the weight of being forgotten. Now, he stood on a different kind of stage, outside a newly opened veterans' housing. Complex sunlight warm on his face, a microphone in his hand, and a crowd gathered not out of obligation, but out of hope. The building behind him wasn't just brick and mortar. It was the first project funded under the New City initiative inspired by his story. Permanent supportive housing for veterans with on-site medical care, job counseling, and peer support. No waiting lists, no endless forms. Just a door that opened when someone knocked. He looked out at the faces. City officials, volunteers, fellow veterans, reporters, and even a few people who'd once walked past him on the street without a second glance. Some of them now nodded at him like old friends. Others wiped their eyes quietly. He didn't feel pride exactly. Not the loud kind. But something quieter, deeper. Peace. He hadn't planned to say much. He never liked long speeches. But as he looked at the building, then at the man standing in the front row, older now, hair grayer, but eyes just as sharp, he knew he had to speak from the heart. This place, he began, voice steady, isn't just about roofs and beds, it's about saying you matter. Not because of what you did in uniform, but because you're human. And every human deserves a chance to come home, even if home got lost along the way. He paused, glancing at the judge. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. She'd fought hard for this project, using her influence not for headlines, but for real change. She'd even helped design the intake process so it centered dignity, not bureaucracy. After his short remarks, the crowd clapped, not out of politeness, but because they felt it. Then came the ribbon cutting. But instead of scissors, they used a pair of old dog tags, one from his service years, the other from the judge's late brother. Symbolic, yes, but also real. A bridge between past and future. Later that day, back at the outreach center where he now worked full-time, he sat with a new arrival, a woman in her 50s, Army veteran, recently evicted after her disability claim was delayed for the third time. She sat stiffly, arms crossed, eyes wary. I don't need pity, she said before he could even speak. I'm not offering any, he replied, sliding a cup of coffee toward her. Just a place to start. She eyed him for a long moment, then took the cup. You one of those success stories they keep talking about? He smiled faintly. I'm just someone who got a second chance, and I'm here to help you get yours. She didn't say much after that, but she stayed. And that was enough. Over the next few weeks, he walked her through the new fast-track system, the one born from the Recognition Act. Within 10 days, she had temporary housing. Within 3 weeks, her medical records were updated, her benefits reinstated. It wasn't magic, it was just people choosing to act like people. Word spread. More veterans came forward, not because they saw a miracle, but because they saw proof. The system could bend toward compassion if someone pushed it. He never sought the spotlight. When news crews came, he pointed to the team. The social workers, the volunteers, the counselors who showed up day after day without fanfare. They're the real heroes, he'd say. And he meant it, but his presence mattered. Because he was living proof that someone could fall all the way to the bottom and still rise, not through luck, but through the simple, powerful act of being seen. On quiet evenings, he'd sit on his balcony again, the city lights blinking below. Sometimes he'd write in his old notebook, letters he never sent, thoughts he needed to release. Other times he'd just listen to the night, distant laughter, a dog barking, the hum of life continuing. He still wore the coat with the flag patch, though now it hung in his closet, clean and preserved. He'd bought a new one, still simple, still humble, but this one didn't carry the weight of survival. It carried the lightness of belonging. One Saturday morning, he visited the cemetery where the judge's brother was buried. He didn't bring flowers, just stood for a few minutes, hand resting lightly on the headstone. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. "I didn't disappear." He didn't expect an answer. But as he turned to leave, a breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves like a sigh of relief. Back in the city, change kept rippling. Other towns began adopting similar models: streamlined housing access, trauma-informed intake, veteran peer navigators. National organizations cited his story in policy briefs, not as a feel-good anecdote, but as a blueprint. Yet none of that was what kept him going. What kept him going was the young Marine who got his GED last month and started community college. The Vietnam vet who finally got his PTSD treatment and now leads a support group. The woman who reunited with her grandchildren after getting stable housing. These were the victories that didn't make headlines, but they changed lives. And in the end, that's all he'd ever wanted. To make sure no one else had to sit alone on a cold bench wondering if their service, their sacrifice, their very name had been erased. Now, when he walked down the street, people didn't look away. They nodded. Some said thank you. Others just smiled, a small human acknowledgement that said, "I see you." And that was enough. Because the real story wasn't about a courtroom moment or a viral video. It was about what happened after, the quiet daily choice to treat each other with respect, to remember that behind every statistic is a person with a past, a name, and a right to be heard. He'd once been invisible. Now he made sure others weren't. And in doing so, he'd found something he thought he'd lost long ago. Not just a home, but purpose. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that shows up day after day and says simply, "You're not alone." And in a world that often feels divided, that might be the most powerful message of all.